Hello and welcome back to the Cloud Chronicles. We're kind of done with our networking set of videos. We not saying we
All
won't come
10.
back to networking because it's so prevalent, but today we're going to start another series that we planned on doing on Azure Data Platform. I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm Principal Cloud Architect at 3Cloud Solutions, and I'm here with John.
I'm John Morehouse. I'm a principal consultant with D'Antoni and Associates.
So you might ask, what is Azure Data Platform? And to be completely honest with you, it's a made-up marketing term.
Yes.
I think John and I have both written a lot of training for Microsoft in various formats, and one of the challenges is always trying to explain to people what Azure Data Platform is. But I think it's kind of important that we have this term because it does encompass all of the data things, but mainly it is just a confusing marketing term. Um,
I'd agree.
yeah, it's a large number of services that are quasi-related or in some cases share code bases. So one of the things we're going to talk about, there's a bunch of different services that are kind of all based on SQL Server, but there are also other services there that are not based on SQL Server, or some are based on a fork of SQL Server. The parallel data warehouse fabric is kind of fork there. This is going to be a fairly long series of videos, kind of like our networking thing. We're going to do a deep dive on each of these services, but today we're just going to do is kind of give you a brief overview of all of the services that are available and just talk lightly through them and talk about some use cases. All right, here's our breakdown. SQL Server-based relational databases. Start naming some services, John.
Azure SQL Database. I'm trying to fix my network.
Yeah, Azure SQL Database, one of the first Azure services, the artist formerly known as SQL Azure. We're going to talk later in this video about some of the different options you can have while John hopefully plugs in a network cable.
That's literally what I'm doing.
We also have SQL Server Managed, or excuse me, Azure SQL Managed Instance, which used to be called Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, which was really confusing. That's a little bit different implementation of Azure SQL Database that's designed to be easier to migrate to. We'll talk about why that's the case. We have within Azure SQL Database, we have a bunch of variations like elastic pools, hyperscale, confidential databases. All of those things are basically the same service, which is like different either backend offerings or different solutions. In general, the architecture of SQL Database and managed instance are pretty similar. But as we go through this series, we'll talk about the key differences and why you want to be especially careful with some of those services. Non-SQL Server-based relational databases. I remember we were at MVP Summit. I don't know if you were an MVP yet. No, because you got awarded right when you started at DCAC, right?
2017, October
Okay, yeah,
2017.
I'm pretty sure this was 2016 Summit. It might have been 2017 Summit, but like we had this like secret meeting about this big project that they kicked all the non-data platform MVPs at, and it was like at the end of a day, and we are like, "Ooh, this is going to be really cool." And they're like, "We're building MySQL and Postgres as a service," and all the MVPs were like, "That's cool, but like." Did it have to be all that secret? We're talking about open source software. AWS does this. It's going to be kind of interesting when we talk about these services because one of the things I find a little bit interesting, John, you said you haven't built these that much, but we'll demo it not in this video, but in the other videos. Postgres is like the closest thing to Azure, like building your own VM for a PaaS service that I've seen in all of these solutions. Like you choose the disk you want, you choose the size of the VM you want. You choose a lot of other options.
I think that's handy. I think that feature should come to the SQL side. I think
Yeah,
that'd be
and
really
I
cool
think
if
one
we
of the
could.
things we should have mentioned when we were talking about SQL Server there is obviously Azure SQL Data, Azure SQL. Damn it, I'm going to say Azure SQL and I mean to say SQL Server a lot, so just forgive us. SQL Server on Azure VMs is also one of those SQL Server-based platforms, and there's a lot of cool things in that, and we'll talk about that too. Azure also offers NoSQL databases, and these are part of it. Cosmos DB, which we're going to laugh about name changes a lot here because all of these solutions have had their names changed multiple times. But Cosmos DB was originally Document DB. It's a NoSQL database that supports things like JSON storage, JSON document storage, which was hence its original name. But there's also key value stores and GraphQL. Those things are pretty cool for their specific use cases. And I think, but I'm not sure, Redis, there's an Azure Redis service, which is a key value cache that you can put in front of databases. I think that's officially an Azure Data Platform service.
I'd call it that.
Yeah, and then finally or not finally, but the the winner of the name change prize. Uh, so if you're not familiar, Microsoft bought, I think the company name was Data Allegro in like 2008, and out of that we got Parallel Data Warehouse and also column store indexes. That's where that technology came from. Uh,
Yeah, I know that.
and Microsoft originally released a hardware-based product called Parallel Data Warehouse. That was like
Hmm.
a massively parallel data warehouse solution. I don't remember exactly when that happened. It was late 2008, 9 era, maybe a little bit early 2010s. They changed the name of that at some point to Analytics Platform System. Around 2013, 2014, we got SQL Data Warehouse. In 2017, they changed the name of that to Synapse. Synapse still exists, confusingly, but we also have Fabric-based data warehouses starting in 2024. So it's been a continued evolution, largely of the same code base, and unfortunately, it still does not have the same T-SQL footprint as SQL Server, which is probably the most common complaint about it. And then finally, we have Azure Data Lake Storage here. And I present Azure Data Lake Storage. I think it's Azure Data Lake V2 is specifically what you want. This is just a
Yep.
hierarchical file system put on top of blob storage. So you can use Azure Data Lake Storage as kind of a source for your data lake. Pretty common pattern in modern data lake architectures. If you're using Databricks, if you're using Fabric or Synapse, you can do those things as well. You also have other options around using things like OneLake. All right, John. Let's start talking a little bit about these. I'll stop sharing here, and let's start talking about Azure SQL DB and those
Ish.
variants a little bit.
I love Azure SQL Database. I
Mhm.
I I remember when it was in its infancy, and you had, if I remember right, there was like a 1 gig limit, or there was something,
Five. It
was it
was five.
five?
I think it was like 3 and 5. I wrote. Bob Ward has a book, and I can't remember which one it's. But he covers. It's one of his recent books. Covers the history of Azure SQL Database. I think it's his book on Azure SQL.
I just remember years ago I worked with a client in a former life, and they wanted to use it, and so I remember playing around with it way back when, and watching it progress and evolve to, I think it's a really stable service.
Hmm.
I highly recommend it for new clients, especially if they're writing something new in the cloud. Migrating to it, we can go on and on about that.
And
We
we
want
and we
backups.
will and we will in that
Uh,
video. Yeah, yeah. I,
Backups. Backups
I I
first.
I just wrote an email about it. Somebody emailed the DL today and was like, "How do I restore to a Fabric database?" And it's like, same way you do to an Azure SQL database, you restore to a
You,
SQL server.
yep. So like I said, I love the product. One of the Because it's platform as a service, right? So that means
Hmm.
Microsoft takes care of certain layers of the infrastructure, like under the hood. Um, like one of my favorite pieces is that it takes backups automatically,
Hmm.
right? And I'm sure we'll dive more into like some of these more details, but things like that make my life as a DBA significantly easier. I can stand up disaster recovery with a couple mouse clicks in the Azure portal,
Yeah.
or through Azure CLI or PowerShell, and voila, I've got DR set up for my databases. You know,
One of the key things there too is that it's the three things they really take care of, and this is going to be kind of universal across PaaS services. Backups, high availability. So you're deployed
yep.
into a highly available, at least by default, within one data center, but you can make it across availability zones. Like John mentioned, you can pay extra for DR. HA is always included in PaaS, or nearly always. There's probably some PaaS service that doesn't have HA, but I nearly always included. Uh, you pay extra for DR. Uh, Finally, they patch the OS for you. And one of the things about SQL DB is they tend to have fewer downtime windows for patching than a lot of these other services do.
And
Managed instance is designed to be a little bit more friendly to migrate to. It's challenging. There's some architectural concerns we typically run into, usually around TempDB performance, especially if you put a lot of databases on a managed instance. And we'll talk more about that. But a managed instance is designed to be more analogous to SQL Server. One of the kind of interesting options you have on MI that you don't have on SQL Database is that you can kind of do a code freeze. You can stay locked into the current version of SQL Server, or you can go on the
for
fast
everything in
train
the
or whatever
past.
they call it to accept all all forthcoming changes, so you're closer to SQL DB.
And that's where
Well, go ahead.
I think it's worth noting that Azure SQL Database, that's where Microsoft tests a lot of the new,
Hmm.
right. So when they roll out new things for SQL Server, that's where they it starts there, probably 9 out of 10 times,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
It's pretty. A lot of the 2025 features have been there for
Yep, yep.
2020.
I actually
Yeah.
saw a database recently, and it had the new compatibility level somewhere.
Okay, cool. 170.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So those are the PaaS options. We also have Azure SQL and a VM. And touchy topic right now. Azure SQL and a VM is a cool service, but John and I are frustrated with the storage architecture, which we'll probably talk about in detail in that video.
yeah,
But effectively, we were hoping they would move away from using Windows storage spaces and they with V2 storage because it's not needed. And unfortunately, a decision seems to have been made to revert back on that choice and use storage spaces. Not a big deal, but can be frustrating. But generally speaking, VMs cost less than PaaS. You might see some justification from Microsoft that, oh, your management costs go down on PaaS. But the one thing I will say is with PaaS, you get that built-in high availability, so you are paying for that. Uh, the one difference, and hyperscale is an exception to this, but one of the things that's challenging around platform as a service databases is in nearly every case, except for hyperscale, to scale your storage volume, so like let's say your size of data increases 10x, you almost generally always have to increase your compute by 10x. And I think Postgres is an exception to this
they're
too. I
tied.
think you can do the volume separately. But like in all of the Azure SQL DB, and that's not hyperscale and MI, if you want to scale storage, you have to scale compute, which when you're using Postgres isn't as bad because you're not paying however much Microsoft charges you a month for the SQL Server component of that. But in SQL Server, it's really expensive. And like we've run into some cases in MI where customers had kind of large data volumes and they just got killed because they had to buy the max server price. So one of the things that's important to always understand is like, what are your growth patterns and what's that growth going to cost you?
For sure.
Yeah. So non-SQL Server relational databases. I've been doing a lot of work with the
Postgres.
Postgres team on my own channel. You can see some videos I've done. They've done a lot of cool stuff, and in MySQL as well. Microsoft has kind of built a query store for these things. We talked about backups and high availability. John, do you know what sucks on running MySQL or Postgres in your own environment?
If you're talking about backups, I seem to recall it's a dump.
Yes, and also high availability. It's Linux clustering.
Oh, that's right. I remember you had a client that did that.
Yeah, so we had a couple of clients that wanted to do that, and they were both like,
And I seem to remember you swearing a lot.
so both of these clients, our client was actually an MSP, right? Which was frustrating because I couldn't just be like, go buy a cloud service.
Right.
Uh, and both of these clients had like one IT admin or two IT admins, and they wanted like highly available MySQL. And I built it. Like it involves like about 6 different Linux packages that you have to install and get to coordinate and work together. And I could fail it over. But they couldn't figure out how, and I left them like 5-page documents of like how to bring this, like it was legitimately
That's
hard.
it.
Clustering in Linux is really bad. Like what I tell people who want to run their own stuff is either hire a team of engineers, which yeah, that's cheap. uh, Alternatively, run Windows. uh, Windows Server failover clustering is awesome software, I just want to say. I've built Oracle and Postgres clusters on Windows Server failover cluster. You effectively just make the service highly available, and it just works. Uh, or use a cloud service, because then on the cloud service, Microsoft or AWS or Google's taking care of this for you. And I know we're an Azure focused series, but same rules apply on AWS. If you don't have people who really know what they're doing on Linux and you want to make these things highly available, just use RDS or use Azure Database for Postgres. Like it's a pain in the neck. Postgres is mostly a fine database, and I don't want to like crap on it for no reason. It's got some gaps to SQL Server, but if you have a good team, you can manage it. Uh, but the HA sucks. Like it just, and it's not really a fault of the database engine. It's a fault of Linux, in my opinion. SQL Server high availability on Linux sucks. I think that's one of the reasons why SQL Server hasn't had more uptake on Linux.
I'd agree. I do know that I have more clients interested in looking at Postgres, either
Hmm.
the Azure service
Hmm.
or actually running their own on VMs, in part because of the licensing.
Yeah,
Because it's cheaper. The license but it's
I'm
community
actually doing
based.
a talk this
Hmm?
week at Bits on why
Oh yeah,
SQL Server is still worth it. And it's kind of interesting. So one of the places where I think it's a big gap is column store, because SQL Server is column store. There's some things in Postgres, some extensions in Postgres that kind of do column store, but a couple of them you have to pay for, and it's just hard to beat for data warehouse type workloads. It's just really hard to beat column store. So that's
Comsto's
something
cool.
that is been in mind. But if you just need a database, and there are cases where that licensing thing's a real concern. Like I think we get frustrated as consultants because our clients read things from like Facebook and Google where they're like, yeah, we built this service that served millions of customers and we use Postgres. And it's like, yeah, how many engineers that work at Facebook or Google uh, did you have on the project, right? And the shop that wants to implement this has like two developers and like a Windows domain admin, and they're like, yeah, we can run Postgres too. And it's like, well, first you have to convert your app, and then yeah, it's not trivial. um
And there's the question of support.
yeah, and that's, to me, the support thing's one of the other reasons why you want to go with a cloud service, because then you have
I,
support. And you can buy support for those services on prem too, but it's a little bit messier. But uh, like I said, the other big value add, I mentioned this earlier, Microsoft has built the query store for those services. It's only available in the cloud, which I have my frustrations about open source rules and stuff like that, but it is what it is. But yeah, if you're going to use those databases, which are solid for a lot of use cases, use them in the cloud. Don't try
highly
to do
agree.
them on prem.
Highly agree.
Unless you're at Meta, like then yeah, if you
Yeah,
have like
unless you got
10
the
engineers who contribute to the code, you're probably fine running it on prem. Uh, NoSQL. What do you know about Cosmos DB besides it's expensive?
it's expensive. Well, it can be expensive,
Yeah.
right? I've always considered it one of the more expensive services in Azure. As it scales up and you consume more of it. I do know that it's JSON based. I do have some clients actually run Cosmos for
Hmm.
the right project. Looking at the documents and exploring the JSON document itself, in the Cosmos database. Um, I Most of my clients don't run Cosmos. I do have other clients that are interested in it. I'm like, well, you make sure you price it out right, because the pricing structure is a little wonky, I think, because it's what RUs.
Yeah, it's our use.
Yeah. So trying to figure out how much that's really going to cost you in the long term. Um,
Yeah, and realistically, Cosmos and all those new SQL databases kind of came up. I did a lot of work on these in their early days during when I was at Comcast, and a lot of this was right when we were getting SSDs for storage in general, and they were starting to come into broad use. And I feel like relational databases were the place where, as our workloads were increasing heavily, we were seeing big hits to performance because we just had too much write latency. Because as I recall, EMC, and Denny would know this, but EMC didn't go to 64-bit on their head units until like 2011. Like they were running like Windows 2008 32-bit on their head units, which meant you could only put, I forget what the 32-bit RAM limit, I think it was 128 gig. You can only put 128 gig on an array. So in a lot of workloads that didn't have like specialized hardware were really write constrained, and a lot of these databases evolved out of two things. They wanted to be more friendly to developers, and frankly, they are in terms of like just writing JSON documents. You can have your arguments about uh, the data quality in those, but they do give flexibility there, and they do give faster writes because they frequently will trade off consistency um,
which
for performance, which
does
is
Cosmos have the multi-write?
Yeah, Cosmos does also have multi-write,
Is
which
right?
is like a feature that every CIO wants, and
Yeah, and they want it in SQL too.
no one else actually wants. Multi-write being where you can write to both regions. Conceptually, if you're a SQL Server person, which I'm sure many of you are, multi-write is not that different from merge replication. It's implemented slightly better, but all variations of merge replication have the same problem. If you have high levels of conflicts, you're gonna spend a lot of CPU cycles on conflict resolution. So that's always the challenge. But Cosmos, when used properly, is a really effective database and can be used cost effectively. You just have to it's one of those things where you have to put a lot of thought into it, and you kind of want to be designing an app around Cosmos.
Kind of like you have to put some thought in your Azure networking.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny how like all these things can cost a lot if you do
There's
them
a common theme here.
terribly wrong. Planning is important.
Planning is important. Got to plan.
Okay, Synapse and Fabric-based
Mm.
data warehouses. Let's talk about those.
We should talk to Megan. We should do when we talk about that, we should bring Megan in.
we should. Do you know what massively parallel processing means?
Uh, Architecturally,
Yeah,
multiple. I equate it in my head as like spreading the workload across multiple processors.
yeah,
Right. So you can parallelize that workload across multiple boxes, and then it comes all back together.
yeah. So you have a head unit. In boxes is the key there. You have a head node that's the control node, and then you have, depending on the size of your data warehouse, you have multiple nodes that process data, and you
It's
partition that data across the nodes. And really,
my
the key. Go ahead.
the DBA SQL DBA version of that. It's CX packet with CX consumer,
Exactly.
right?
Good.
But across multiple
Yeah.
pieces of hardware.
And you want uh, ideally you want all that traffic to go up and down.
Right.
You're kind of one of the challenges there is you're ultimately limited by how much memory the head node has to build result sets. That's something that's always been limiting on those systems. And then secondly, if you have data where you have a lot of east-west traffic, that quickly becomes inefficient. So it's really important to optimize your partitioning scheme for this. Realistically, unless you have more than a couple of terabytes of data, you shouldn't be using one of these systems. There's a lot, like anything else in computer science, parallelism has a lot of overhead, and it's only worth it for larger data sets. And the typically we like to say that's around 2 terabytes here, but give or take. Uh, the Fabric implementation of this is new and exciting and has lots of new and exciting
Features,
surprises,
surprises, gotchas,
gotchas. So be
pitfall.
careful there. Synapse is a little bit more mature, I think, but Microsoft's not really investing money in it.
It's all Fabric.
Yeah, it's a. If I was making a decision on one of these systems, ooh, it's a hard call. I would also keep in mind that Databricks and Snowflake are out there, and you can run on Azure too. And those solutions may be better suited that are more mature, depending on your level of effort. First,
That's a really good question about what would you choose.
first,
I mean, like Synapse or Fabric or Databricks.
so I have this article that's in my Dropbox that I want to stay in MVP, so I haven't submitted it to Redmond. Uh, but yeah, I kind of have some feelings about Fabric. The concept of Fabric is really good. The implementation is about as bad as the concept is good. Like
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I probably would look at more at Synapse just because I think it's a little bit more mature.
yeah, and I don't
Right.
think they're gonna. I don't think they're gonna kill it off. If you had a solution that fits nicely in the wheelhouse of Synapse, and you wanted to stick on like native Azure and using T-SQL, that's where you could see some benefits. Some interesting discussions I've had here with folks like at Microsoft are like, well, what if we just use SQL Database hyperscale and like a bunch of column store indexes? Wouldn't we have pretty much close to the same performance? Because hyperscale scales out horizontally. It's not exactly an MPP system, but
It's close.
similarly. Uh,
It's close.
and and I'm not going to name names, and I'm not going to say exactly what they said, but yeah, they were like, it's going to be pretty close. so so keep that in mind. These kind of massively parallel systems are really good if you're have massive data sets, but like if you have smaller amounts of data may not be beneficial. The other area where we see this whole analytic change, and this leads into our next thing with data lake, is where you're consuming a lot of your data from APIs. So like if a lot of your transactional systems are running as software as a service, so like Salesforce or Stripe, and you're consuming just JSON data from APIs, that's where you're gonna like want to have a data lake to land that JSON. You'll do the transform, kind of the whole modern data warehouse solution that we've talked about. Is it still modern if it's like 12 years old? But that's basically the notion there. So like that's why we have data lake on the slide, because it's commonly used for when we talk about medallion architecture. That's a common place to land your bronze layer, which your bronze layer just means the raw data you're getting from your source systems, and that's kind of that common pattern where you'll get that raw data, you'll do some transforms, and then maybe transform it into another area of your data lake, and then eventually load it into either a parallel data warehouse like Fabric, or if you're smaller, a SQL database, or maybe even a Fabric database. Any other thoughts on analytics or
Where? Well, no, I'm not. It's deprecated, so I wasn't going to ask that question.
what
Okay.
service?
I was just thinking, and our friend Ben might yell at us, but where did BDC fit?
So BDC is a lot like Fabric architecturally.
So, but do you classify it in that Synapse Fabric
Yeah. It had some of the
PDW
elements.
range?
It
So
had some of
it
the
was a
elements of that.
data platform
Yeah.
solution. So
Yeah,
it just popped in my head.
it had scale out in the caching tier. The problem with
It's deprecated.
BDC, it was really like you had to have your own Kubernetes to implement, which I think that scared a lot of people off. Conceptually, it's not that different from Fabric, and I'd argue code-wise it was probably a little bit better because they didn't try to reinvent everything like Fabric has. They just really used some of the core things that SQL had. Like if they had delivered that as a PaaS service where you like click through and built your own BDC, I think it could have been more successful. Alas, it was not, and that got killed really quick.
It did get, yeah,
yeah.
kind of like StretchDB got.
No, StretchDB took like 5 years to get killed.
It got deprecated pretty quickly. It just took 5 years for them to actually remove it. And it was also crazy expensive.
We were at MVP Summit one year, and they were like showing us they showed us it's deprecated, so I feel safe talking about this. They showed us like features and number of customers and like this terrible pie chart. But I saw the StretchDB. I caught the StretchDB number, and it was like single digits. Yeah, it would. StretchDB was this. If you're new to SQL Server, it was introduced in SQL Server 2016, and it was originally this really good concept where like you had an Azure SQL Database, which this was pre-hyperscale, so or no, not even Azure SQL Database, an on-prem SQL database or an Azure SQL database. No, it's just on-prem, and you're running out of space, and you had a table that was like say a terabyte, and you wanted to offload some of that table into an Azure SQL database. You could do that by using StretchDB, and you could issue a single query from your on-prem database, and it would span both places. It had a lot of limitations in V1, but it was originally built on SQL Database, which meant it was pretty cheap. Like it was like $100 a month. But then right before launch, somebody at Microsoft decided that, hey, we should have fewer customers for this, and we should make each of them spend a lot more. So let's sell it on. It was a variation on Azure SQL Data Warehouse. The problem with that was, in my opinion, customers that like need a terabyte of storage in a short term, those are your small customers who aren't going to want to spend thousands of dollars a month. If like a Fortune 500 company is down to their last terabyte of storage, A, somebody's getting fired. But B, when they need another terabyte of storage, they call the storage team and they're like, "Hey, those 10 arrays you ordered last month, we need another terabyte out of that." It's not something that affects big customers, and it only affects smaller customers, in my experience, anyway. But yeah, StretchDB was something that was really good in concept and would have been perfect with hyperscale. But alas, we can't have nice things.
Nope. Like backups and restores to Azure SQL Database. Did I just say that out loud? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'll bitch. I mean, talk more about that later. Uh, all right, that's your overview of this. Like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more detailed coverage of all of our favorite Azure Data Platform options. With that, have a nice day.
Yeah, have a great day. We'll see you next time.
All right, bye.